All right. Well, hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History, and I would like to say thank you for joining us today for the first webinar in a six-part series exploring the new scholarship related to the World War II home front, facilitated as part of the National Park Service's commissioning of an update to the 2007 theme study on the topic. Over the next few weeks, we're going to delve into several topics related to the home front. And today we'll be hearing from Dr. Matt Basso on environmental history in the home front, with special thanks to Scott Morris, a PhD candidate at the University of Utah, one of Matt's students who assisted with the research and the presentation preparation today, but who can't join us. So when you listen to this recording, thank you for all of your work, Scott. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. This webinar and all of the webinars in this series are being recorded, both for anyone who can't attend, who can't stay the whole time, or who wish to be able to revisit the materials that we discuss. Closed captions have been enabled. Click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to access those. Please be sure to keep your microphone muted unless you've been called on to ask a question. And at any time, you can pop questions into the chat area of your Zoom window, and I will note them in our Q&A with Dr. Basso at the end of the presentation. Last, before Matt begins, I want to give a warm welcome to Dr. Emily Button-Cambeck from the National Park Service to give us some words of welcome.
Thank you, Stephanie. And hello, everyone. I am here to welcome you on behalf of the National Park Service's American World War II Heritage City program, and to thank Stephanie and CPH, and thank Dr. Basso and Scott for the work they've done in advancing scholarship on the World War II home front through the theme study update. That research project is in its advanced stages, and we hope that you and others may be able to use it in order to better explore and understand the home front history within your communities and historic sites, as well as to develop new nominations for National Historic Landmarks and other registries. Today's webinar on the environmental history of the home front also has a lot of really important connections to legacies of World War II that we still see in a lot of communities today. So thank you for this work, and thank you. Turn it back over for introductions of Dr. Basso.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to everyone at NPS who's joining us today. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matt Basso. Matt is an associate professor of history and gender studies at the University of Utah and the author of Volume 2 of the National Park Service's World War II and the American Homefront theme study. He's the author or editor of 4 other books, including Meet Joe Cooper, Masculinity and Race in Montana's World War II Homefront from the University of Chicago Press. And his current monograph project uses New Zealand history to consider settler masculinity through the lens of work and war. In collaboration with his students, he's partnered on public history projects with the National Park Service, Forest Service, Smithsonian Institution, Utah Humanities, the Utah Division of Indian Affairs, and other state and local organizations. And for anyone in the audience considering a funded MA or PhD program, Matt would be absolutely happy to talk with you about that. But Matt, I'm turning it over to you. We will have a presentation and then we'll have lots of opportunity for Q&A at the end. So again, feel free to pop questions in the chat at any time and we'll try to get through them all. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate you doing advertising for the University of Utah's History Department. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. You were fortunate enough not to be on a couple of minutes ago when the power went out where I am. So hopefully we're going to have a smooth ride, but we'll see. I want to say an especially large thank you to NCPH, Stephanie, of course, but the whole gang. It's been really a pleasure working with them. The same is true for National Park Service and the NPS history team, especially the National Historic Landmark program historians who have just been fantastic and have taught me so much. Likewise, my research team, Scott Morris, who prepared this presentation with me, can't make it today, but he's just representative of a fantastic group of graduate students and undergraduate students that I've had the good fortune of working with on each of the components of this somewhat sprawling effort to do more justice to the remarkable history of the World War II home front. I am going to do my best to get through what is an enormous amount of material, but I urge you, when the publication of Volume 2 comes out, you'll find a long chapter on environmental history, and I hope you'll have a chance to take a look at that. I hope it's a useful resource. So in 40 minutes or so, I have far too much to cover. I am going to do my best to describe the slides as well. I'm speaking to you from Salt Lake City. I'm a middle-aged history professor wearing glasses and a goatee. And the slide you're looking at is a photograph of workers leaving the Anaconda smelter in Montana during World War II. This is one of the places that's nearest and dearest to my heart, as I've written the most about World War II homefront stuff based off of the histories of Anaconda and Butte. Okay, so let's get cracking here. And I want to start with a roadmap of what we're going to talk about. The photo that is on the screen right now is of a tanker speaking to a couple of kids during World War II. And there's some sense of the impact of the military and its equipment on the home front landscape in this image. Fundamental to note right away is the major argument of this essay and of the work that we've done, and that's the powerful role of homefront militarization in shaping the environmental history of the home front and beyond. Likewise, and I'm going to expand on that in a moment, I want to draw particular attention to the distinctive tools that environmental history provides us. Scott, my co-conspirator here, is an excellent environmental historian, as are many of my graduate students, and they would be frustrated if I did not note that combining these two pieces together lets us really see via case studies the way that militarization created both changes to the landscape and waterscape, if you will, as well as various different ramifications of pollution that ran relatively unchecked. Okay, you're seeing a picture in front of you from the Portland City Archives of Vanport, just outside of Portland. Both what it looked like during the war, it was a very large housing community near industrial sites, and the flooding that took place and took a huge amount of pollution into the waterways and onto the landscape as flooding took place just after the war. So why use environmental history? Why are we focusing one chapter out of our 5 on environmental history? Simply because if it is of enormous interest to Americans and to scholars and students, and that's for good reason. The interactions between human societies, culture, technology, economics, and ecological and environmental systems over time has shown the worth of this approach, right? It's really helped define this approach. Environmental history very much helps us see the place of politics in our decisions about environment, and of course the decisions based off of social and cultural factors as well. Capitalism plays a major part in this. All right. Many more things to say about environmental history, but no doubt you can find those and you'll see them in our essay. I really want to focus for a quick second on militarism and the shift that we saw in World War II, or at least the lead up to World War II, from really a sense of national security based off of the economic well-being of Americans and defense, but really the economic well-being of Americans in the Great Depression. This is one of the fundamental planks of the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal, of course. With World War II, the idea of national security much more solidly becomes about defense and about the use of the armed forces. And that has vast ramifications. So, for instance, the historian James Sparrow talks about a shift from a welfare state to a warfare state between the Great Depression and World War II. Other scholars, I'm borrowing here from Peter Rody and others, have really remarked on this shift in ideas about national security. And they often cite Roosevelt himself, who during the war, at the beginning of the war and mobilization, constantly reinforced the need for production, more and more production. And central to him noting that Americans had to go all out for production was protecting soldiers. So soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines become representative of a new idea about militarization, about production, but also a new way of seeing the environment, if you will. So checks on environmental resource use, checks on corporations and production that had been in place prior to World War II. Many of those went away, and instead it was production for defense of the nation, but especially to support those soldiers. Corporations and the government used this new ideological perspective to pretty dramatically change the environment on the home front. All right, I'm showing you here a slide, a map of the different defense sites of the Manhattan Project. And in the top right-hand corner of this slide is a picture of the Hanford site, circa 1960. Below that is a picture of the Trinity test explosion. When we think about the militarization of the home front, which is one of the major themes, again, here specifically the place of the War Department in changing the environment, we think first and foremost about the Manhattan Project. This map shows you, of course, Los Alamos, but it shows you sites around the country as well, most famously Oak Ridge and Richland. Each of these sites represents our current understanding, if you will, the common understanding of the way that the World War II home front and militarization impacted the US environment. While it, of course, makes complete sense to focus on Trinity and on the Manhattan Project, the impact of the military on the landscape is much more vast than that. For instance, the military and the War Department brought upwards of 50 million acres under its control on the home front, and a huge number of those acres were used for new military bases, but also for things like ordnance plants and, of course, things like the Manhattan Project sites. I want to talk about Eglin Air Force Base briefly as an example of really an enormous number of places that could have been case studies for this. So on the left, you see an image of the national forest in which Eglin was carved out of around 1940. And then here you're seeing an image of Eglin and how much land it ended up covering. We see a 1,500 acre landing strip, but that was only really one small part of the impact of this massive base and the huge bombing range that was off the coast in the Gulf of Mexico. Bombing ranges are yet another way that the World War II home front landscape was impacted by the military. There's construction contractors that are part of this, not just military members, but it's also, I want to remind you, part of this ideology that saw defense of the nation and serving soldiers as the principal thing that Americans should be thinking about, including in regard to environmental use. All right, there's a bunch of different ways that this manifested. I just noted bombing ranges. Here you're seeing an image on the lower right of some explosions at Vieques, one of the large island off of the main island in Puerto Rico, which was turned into an absolutely massive bombing range, as were the aquatic environments off of Vieques. But it happened in many other different ways too. That is this militarization of the landscape through kind of the use of ecologically sensitive sites. So for instance, here you're seeing a picture of the Yosemite Hotel. This is in part because Scott loves this hotel, but the hotel was used by soldiers as a recuperation site. It's partially representative of the use of National Park Service land, and even more so Forest Service land and other ecologically sensitive areas for military training. Perhaps the best known or really representative example is the damage that was done to Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. This is just part of the story of kind of a voluminous bombardment of landscapes, and especially in the Hawaiian Islands. The NPS planners felt like they had to, by and large, give into this, again, for the ideology I've already stated. There was some defense of these lands, but nonetheless, weapons practice, military maneuvers left really a trail of damage that wasn't just short-term, but long-term to these environments. Back to Puerto Rico, just as a reminder, huge swaths of the island aren't just bombed, but they're turned into military bases. And the military bases around the United States had a pretty significant trail of both water and earth pollution. Okay, I want to move on and talk about war production sites. And specifically, I want to start at the earlier stage, which is resource extraction. Here you're looking at a poster from World War II, one of many propaganda images that speak to the environmental history of the home front and that talk about the use of the environment to defend the nation and to provide for soldiers. This is the idea that lumber is absolutely central to the defense of the nation. Our resource extraction section of the chapter speaks about forestry, hard rock metals mining, and energy development in great detail. Forestry is a pretty remarkable story. In 1942, for example, National Geographic magazine said that the war would be thought of as the age of alloys, and certainly it was, right? This speaks to metal mining. But by 1943, the War Manpower Commission was describing timber as the Allies' most critical strategic asset. What that ended up meaning was that billions of board feet was pulled from the nation's forests to build factories, employee housing. The military needed huge amounts to construct defense facilities and even weapon systems, including ones you would be perhaps surprised to know. So for every Waco C-62 cargo plane, 40,000 board feet of timber was needed for framing. Aircraft carrier decks had 140,000 board feet, and sort of on, including the ammunition boxes that are partially represented in this poster. Conservation efforts, therefore, that had been significant during the Great Depression and before, or at least somewhat significant, basically ceased to exist during the war in regard to the nation's forests, both public and private. If there was a voice for conservation, though, there were certainly some experts, and even the head of the Forest Service was worried about this, but timber workers, unionized timber workers, were among the few who expressed concern about the damage that timber extraction was doing, especially to old growth forests and the clear cutting of newer strands. But any sort of critique of this was seen as unpatriotic. Again, this theme that militarization changes the ideology within the United States towards the environment, and that has a dramatic effect, not just during the war or even just on the continental home front, but in the US territories and after the war. These timber workers had a vision that Stephen Beda, who's written really a wonderful book about this, calls labor environmentalism. And they did what they could to try to protect some conservation efforts. These would be ratcheted up in the post-war in complicated but important ways. But the home front was without question an era of deep resource extraction. That, of course, goes for hard rock mining as well. I mentioned Anaconda and Butte earlier. Huge amount of copper, zinc, and other minerals pulled out of those now National Historic Landmark sites, and really an enormous amount of environmental damage. Here's another example. This is an image on the screen right now of stibnite in Idaho. Stibnite grew exponentially during the war because it held, and I apologize for my historian, not scientist, pronunciation, antimony and tungsten, huge amounts of it that were needed for alloys. Aluminum is another story. This is not an aluminum mine, but aluminum was also incredibly important. By 1943, the US was using 9 million tons of aluminum a year. At the end, just before the war, excuse me, at the end of the Great Depression, it was only using 300,000 tons. So you get a sense of the growth of extraction, hard rock extraction during the war. So this site here in Stibnite became an open pit mine during the war. It's right along a branch of the Snake River, and the pollution, both from water running through it, land pollution, of course, but also tailings and rock piles, eventually made this site also a Superfund site in the post-war. So a pretty incredible. I said the Snake River. I'm sorry, it's the East Fork of the complicated name. East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River that was diverted, and that water pollution ended up being a big part of that story because of the stibnite mining, which is also part of the yellow pine mining area. Okay, uranium mining is even yet another story. We speak about that extensively in the environmental history chapter of Volume 2, and we also speak about it in the Native American and Indigenous history chapter of the volume, and we'll be speaking about that. Do you see how I'm kind of alerting you to upcoming presentations? We'll be speaking about that in next week's webinar, same time, same place sort of thing. And I hope you can join us for that. But uranium mining did significant damage to the landscape, but especially to the miners. And these that we focus on are DNA miners who, along with their community, ended up with really pretty horrific health effects due to this mining. Okay, I want to talk a little bit then about energy development as part of this story. And we focus in the chapter on hydroelectric, coal, and petroleum. While the hydroelectric story tends to turn to the Great Depression and the growth of the TVA and Columbia River projects during that era, during World War II, the government built 40 new dams or completed 40 new dams. And these were essential, of course, to hydroelectric power, but they had a very significant impact on aquatic ecology, and river systems that, of course, is and continues to be in headlines about dam removal to this day. Petroleum is covered significantly in the chapter and links up to the military and industrial development, for example, of the Gulf Coast, the United States Gulf Coast, which saw really dramatic environmental changes during World War II. Brian Black, a historian of petroleum and petroleum development, argues that while we talk about petroleum and high energy usage beginning in the 1920s, noting that it slowed during the Great Depression, he says that the definitive shift in this kind of high energy use ideology, again, if you will, occurred during World War II when combatant nations worked hard to make sure they had the resources to fuel not just their domestic production, but also the machines that were part of industrial conflict. So, for instance, the new modes of combat that World War II was defined by required mobility and, of course, a huge use of resources. Every one of America's 16 armored divisions, for instance, used around 60,000 gallons of gasoline per day for the 269 tanks and 1,141 vehicles that were part of their ensemble of mechanized equipment. The environmental impact of this on the Gulf Coast was especially felt in wetland loss and in pollution, both of water and landscapes. This is yet another example of the significance of the environmental impact of the World War II home front on the United States and its broader environment. Now, of course, the headline story with World War II is the US being an arsenal of democracy. And when we talk about the arsenal of democracy, we talk both about the products from factories and from farms. The American farmer reacted admirably to the demands that the US government put on it to help feed not just American soldiers, but also many of our allies. They were rewarded for this and thus were especially compelled to do so while costs went up 16%, prices went up 42%. Pork production increased by 63%, beef by 37%, grains were up by 15%. So really pretty remarkable progress given that one of the challenges was labor. We talk about this labor story both in this environmental history chapter, but also in our Latino history chapter. And it's an important story that brings in a number of groups that are headliners, if you will, in the World War II home front story. So the effort to produce during World War II on American farms ultimately involved fertilizers and chemicals. Those scholars have said that the bigger effect of those fertilizers and chemicals that were developed during World War II were felt in the post-war. DDT is likely the headliner for this story. It had a profound agricultural impact, ecological impact, and obviously also an economic impact. The US military starts using it in 1943 to combat insect-borne disease, but it's being marketed aggressively to farmers by 1945. It's one chemical in a sea of insecticides, herbicides, and fertilizers that, as I've noted, were essential to post-war farming. So you see an advertisement on the right-hand side of this slide for it, and on the left side you see an advertisement seeking farm labor for this productive effort that went on the home front. I'll note too that fertilizers that use nitrogen, which was also used for munitions production, had a dramatic effect on not just the land, but also on waterscapes in the US. This is also a moment in which soybeans entered US farming in force, right, in really large numbers, as well as a couple of other important new plants or a growth of a couple of different plant areas. I'm going to talk about conservation and collective action here in a couple of moments, but before I do so, I want to make sure that I touch on war production itself. Here on the screen, you'll see an image of tanks and Navy ships, merchant marine ships on a coastal embarkation zone, a couple of docks, and on the right you see pictures of the women that would come to be known as Rosie the Riveter, right? The women that helped build these vessels. This gain in war production, of course, required vast new factories, some of which were next to military bases or even on military bases, but many of which were in US cities. The ramp up of production in the United States had really incredible consequences on urban pollution and on the downstream pollution that produced. I want to quickly note that there's a crossover between military production, in fact, military control, and war production. I would, for example, cite the Joliet Army Ammunition Plant in Illinois, which had 14 square miles of manufacturing area, 22 square miles devoted to assembling, loading, and packing munitions. Arkansas had 6 of these ordnance plants. They used significant amounts of chemicals. They changed the landscape dramatically, and they also polluted the landscape. Perhaps the signature production facilities in the United States for this sort of stuff are airplane plants. They occur in places like Tinker Field outside of Oklahoma City, the Douglas Cargo Aircraft plant there. They, of course, occur at Boeing facilities, but a huge number of them are in Los Angeles. Los Angeles air pollution, something it's still famous for, though perhaps my city, Salt Lake, should be more famous. Los Angeles air pollution increases dramatically during World War II, partially because of wartime production, partially because of commuting to wartime jobs all over that region. On July 26, 1943, for example, the Los Angeles Times, urging, and if you will, readers to see the environment through a military lens, compared the pollution that the city was facing that day to a gas attack. Residents told the paper that the city's air was so bad, their eyes were stinging, their throats sore, and in fact, they felt like it was nearly blocking the sun. The city launched a major, quote unquote, epic war on smog based off of this, but they weren't alone. Places like Pittsburgh and the industrial centers around the Midwest and on the East Coast also saw huge levels of air pollution during the war based off of this production ethos that I talked about earlier. All right, I want to take my last couple of minutes, and I'm wrapping up here, to talk about conservation efforts. So far, I've argued to you that militarization is a theme that we need to pay attention to when we think about the home front and what it did to ideas about the environment, to really our approach and views of the environment. That does not mean that conservation efforts did not occur. They occurred, in fact, in 2 different scales. One, collective efforts, and secondly, individual efforts. I'll speak about collective efforts first, and here I've got an image of a CPS smoke jumper. Some of you will know that smoke jumpers emerged in a significant way during World War II, including conscientious objectors that were smoke jumpers. Also the triple nickel and all black smoke jumping, a military unit that did smoke jumping. But the CPS effort on this front was meant to try to put out forest fires. And it is, of course, a conservation effort that continued well past the post-war, but that was begun on the home front. More significantly, if you will, are efforts at conservation that continued by government agencies, including those that followed on from the CCC in various places across the US, shelter belt work and other sorts of things. But it's really this kind of interface between the individual and collective that's the headline story for conservation. So individual efforts, which again were also kind of collective efforts, are headlined by victory gardens. And here I'm showing an image of a World War II poster, a propaganda poster that says, "Grow it yourself. Plan a farm garden now," right? There's a bunch of these sorts of posters, and it's intriguing to think about what was the ethos behind this. Was were victory gardens really about providing enough food for home front folks? Were they about getting everybody to pitch in together and feel like they were part of the national effort to win the war? Or were they a new attitude towards conservation? Notably, for working class folks, immigrant communities, communities of color, victory gardens were nothing new. They just had a new name. So the effort to kind of provide for yourself was necessary for economic reasons and for other reasons, but especially economic reasons all over the United States. What was new is middle class and upper middle class Americans taking this on at the national level. Likewise, the effort to recycle, if you will, scrap drives were a similar phenomenon. And we wonder, or should wonder to ourselves, is this yet another impact of national significance, a birth of really a mentality around sustaining our natural resources and doing things for ourselves? Unfortunately, at least for those of us who are nervous about the environment and things like climate change, the answer is no. The conservation that took place during World War II at the individual level, victory gardens and scrap drives, headlining that, did not continue into the post-war. Instead, really this attitude of production being what was critical to national defense and national well-being, as many of you on this webinar will know, dominated. And it did so in a way that was based off of a nation of consumers, a republic of consumers. Elizabeth Cohen, of course, has described it as. This post-war phenomenon then does in fact have links to World War II, but really more as a breaking point from these conservation efforts that I just mentioned and a continuation of this militarization, we argue, of the United States, especially with military production being such an enormous part of what Eisenhower would go on to call the military-industrial complex. We believe that the essential step in this, as do other scholars, but here we're linking it to the environment, was in fact the World War II home front. And with that, as my final note, I'll stop and take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was a fantastic presentation. As people pop their comments and questions in the chat, I wanted to draw attention to a lovely comment from Sarah Lee, who said, "I just wanted to say I'm excited you shared the CPS smoke jumper photo. My grandfather was a conscientious objector, part of the CPS, and did forestry conservation work in Michigan and Washington State." Thank you so much for sharing that. We have our first question from Perry Meldon, who is wondering if you could speak to how the World War II homefront era is in conversation with the before and after of conservation, like 1930s CCC camps and tree plantings, or 1950s suburbanization and environmental concerns.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, and thank you, Perry, for your help on this project and your feedback. So there's a bunch of continuities here, and I'm glad you noted that. It's important to point them out. It's not just the World War II home front that sees industrial production, for example, that has very significant effects on the environment, including pollution. So taking resource extraction, for instance, with mining, there's an effort to try to improve the air quality and water quality of mining communities well before World War II. And it's an effort that families and workers put forward to the resistance or facing resistance from companies which wanted that production because they believed, of course, it gave them higher profits. And they argued back, without the smoke, there's not going to be the wages that you need to survive. Aligned with these workers were folks that we associate with the conservation movement of the progressive era, folks like Teddy Roosevelt. And you know, there was some gains for sure. There was certainly not just effort, but gains. But companies stuck by their guns. I think they struggled more to make that reasoning stick, that production-based reasoning in the New Deal era, except for when it came to the war, when we shifted from welfare to warfare. So that attitude continues on into World War II. I don't want to oversell that and into the post-war, because certainly there's efforts, especially around worker health and by unions, to try to tamp down the worst effects of industrialization and production. But we do, I think, see a sea shift during World War II. In regard to suburbanization, World War II sees a ton of building, as many of you know, and this essay speaks about environmental racism pretty significantly and redlining. Those patterns have often been associated with the post-war, but they're absolutely there during World War II, as a set of really important works of scholarship have showed us. Places like Richmond, California, absolutely saw environmental racism and saw this kind of housing boom with little care for what it meant to the environment. And kind of on these both continuities between the pre-World War II era and the post-World War II era, with the war in the middle. That said, we do think that the World War II home front was nationally significant, had a nationally significant impact on the environment in multiple ways. So I hope folks will look at the volume when it comes out, because we expand those answers. Thank you for your question, Perry.
Thanks, Matt. We have another question from Lori, who wants to know, is it true that during World War II, the mining of coal was prioritized over the mining of gold, and some gold mines were not operating again until after World War II?
It is 100% true. And it's not just gold mines, it's not just coal mining that takes precedence. It's also other hard rock mining for the roots of alloys. So all sorts of gold mines are shut down so that those miners, this is the theory, will come into the workforce at copper mines or in places like stibnite, because that's the priority. Anything that can help with war production, and gold does a little bit of that, but it's not important enough. So it's hard rock mining and both ferrous and non-ferrous mining that are prioritized over gold mining.
Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Donna Graves, who had something that she would like to share live with us.
Hi, Matt, thank you. This makes me so excited to read that chapter and the whole study. I wanted to point out that there is so much continuity that you've been pointing to, and that a lot of historical trends were sort of put on steroids during World War II, and we're still living with the implications, some of them positive and many of them not. I recently, for the National Park Service, co-developed History and Hope for Climate Action, an interpretive toolkit. I was inspired by my work at Rosie the Riveter when I thought, okay, we really have to talk about climate change more at national parks. And when I saw that one of our central themes at Rosie the Riveter, total mobilization, had this corollary of greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at a 20th century graph of greenhouse gas emissions, they shoot up at the end of World War II and just continue to climb. And so that mobilization that we can look at as this really inspiring, powerful story during World War II was also part of what set the stage for the climate crisis we're in. And I just want to add that to the discussion. I think it's really important for talking about the legacy of the home front. And again, I want to thank you. I can't wait to read this study.
Thanks so much, Donna. And you put that beautifully. And thanks for really making that connection for us. That's right, continuities, but as you perfectly put it, the home front puts this on steroids, and I would argue takes away certain conservation tools. For those that were worried about this, and there was certainly a set of Americans that were deeply worried about the direction we were going environmentally in World War II. For those that were worried, they had an enormous challenge talking back to those in power, especially as those in power were often supported by corporations that were profiting from this, but not just corporations, right? This is about defense, and that's why we centered this notion of the soldier. And yet, all these other technological changes are critical to the story and should not be brushed aside for this one ideological story. So we see remarkable mobility during World War II and an interconnected globe. Other scholars have pointed to this that produces just vast amounts more travel, and especially travel by aircraft, right? These sort of jet connections, if you will, around the world are part, just a small part, but part of this change, this connected, resource-rich life that we start living after the war really has its roots in the mobility that World War II helped foster and create. So thank you so much, Donna. That is such a cool project that you all are doing, as I've mentioned to you.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. I put a link to the History and Hope toolkit in the chat as well for anyone who would like to learn more about that. And I also want to say just thanks everyone for keeping the questions and comments going, because I'm not having to do a lot of time stalling. So good job, everybody. We've got another question in the chat from Sarah Lee, who says, with the push for use of DDT and its seemingly positive benefit, was there any larger concern for its damage to the environment? I've read about some environmental scientists from wartime who were concerned about bees and other pollinators being poisoned and harmed by excessive use of pesticides and monocropping.
Yes, thank you for that. And you're precisely right. There is a small group of folks that are worried about what the effect of DDT and other similar substances would have on the environment and on wildlife, bird life, etc. Some of you know that Rachel Carson, of course, is part of this, right? Emerges in this era, and there's others too. Other environmentalists that we associate with the 1960s are deeply shaped by the home front and these new technological applications that we don't know enough about. Now, often when we tell this story and we tell it environmentally, we point to atomic weapons instead of things like DDT, right? We say, well, listen, technology is remarkable and it's also scary, but what ends up happening is that it, as lots of folks on this webinar know, it becomes domesticated, right? Pretty quickly, we're able to say, oh, maybe atomic power is something that's going to be useful for us, atomic medicine, et cetera, et cetera. That that stage of fright, which really hit a lot of Americans after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it just does not happen to that level at all with DDT. There's just a small slice of folks that are worried about this. Most people are deeply excited about this as kind of a technological revolution that's going to help crops, sure, but it's also going to help fight malaria and other things. So by and large, the attitude towards it's really, really positive coming out of World War II. And it's not until the 60s when the concerns start to emerge much more strongly.
Thanks. We've got a great question from Troy Reeves next, who asks, besides the rich photos you shared, what are some of the other sources you, Scott, and the team utilized?
Yeah, thank you, Troy. Hi, Troy. We used a bunch of secondary sources, and I should say that just first and foremost, the work that I've just talked about is on the shoulders of a really remarkable set of environmental historians who've produced just study after study that has kind of changed our understanding of a bunch of stuff, but including the home front. Because of time limitations, we didn't have as much chance to dive into primary sources as we tried to get out these stories and give let them create a context for other scholars to potentially nominate sites for recognition or to do their own important public history work. We did use some photographs, and the study, the volume will have other photographs. I kind of wish I'd used a bunch more here because I love them so much. And we used some statistical stuff, some wartime video stuff. We used propaganda, of course, and some, and I waited for this one last, some first-person accounts, especially those drawn from the most important of all methodologies, oral history. That's a gesture to try. Yeah, we tried to pull from a bunch of stuff, but unabashedly, this is a project that, while interpretive, is meant to bring to the fore the great work that other scholars have done.
Wonderful. We've got really another great comment in the chat from Alicia Hayes, who says, I grew up in Gustavus, Alaska. Gustavus and Yucatan to the north had large runways for ferry aircraft to the Pacific. After the war, they buried thousands and thousands of barrels of tar and all kinds of materials. My school was built on the edge of one of these dumps. There's still a visible rectangular scar from those dumps. Nothing would grow there, and this is in a rainforest. Thank you for that. Donna asks another lovely question, which is, when will the study be public?
I cannot answer that definitively, but it's fully drafted, but we're being very careful with it. We're going through multiple layers of review. It's already done, been through some peer review, it's been through some MPS review. We're going to do one more layer of that, make sure we're happy with the product, and then put it into design and production. I don't know, Stephanie, if we have a date in mind, but I'll throw out maybe as soon as the end of this year, but probably more likely the beginning of 2025.
I would agree with that. We could have time for one more question if anyone wants to pop anything else into the chat. But I do want to say, once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Matt, for this fantastic presentation. Thank you again, Scott, for all of his work behind the scenes, researching and writing and preparing the slides today. Please join us again next week. As Matt said, same time, same place. We'll be meeting on Thursday, September 5th at 3 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be talking about Native American and Indigenous histories in the World War II home front. I want to remind everybody that links to all the recordings from this series will be sent to everyone as they've been processed and posted for viewing. So give us a few days to get those together, but we will share them out. And I also wanted to add that we are working now to include a 6th webinar in this series with Joe Quinata from the Guam Preservation Trust to talk with us about Guam's history and culture in the World War II in the Pacific Islands. By registering for this series, you'll automatically be provided with access to that additional presentation. But I just wanted to share that we have another exciting presentation to look forward to. So thank you again, Matt, for all of this hard work, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to the National Park Service for making all of this possible and for investing so much in this fantastic work. Thank you, Kathleen Madigan, for popping into the chat some links to other World War II homefront resources that are related to this project. Any closing words of wisdom, Matt, before we?
No, I'll just say thank you too. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to ask these questions. It's, as I've noted already, it's been a joy working on this project. I have all sorts of things to say about Alaska and the territories, and really this kind of rich environmental story that needs to be told. So I'm excited to see so many public historians on here, lots of folks who have helped me in the past. Just a big thank you. We'll be talking about some of that history of the U.S. territories next week as well in the Indigenous and Native American section and other places too. So excited to potentially see some of you back next week. And thanks again for keeping everything in order here, Stephanie.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you next week. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.